Alira's hand was an inch from the iron when the voice cracked through the corridor like a whip. "Step away from that door." She spun around, heart slamming against her ribs. Captain Bram stood at the end of the hallway, torchlight carving hard shadows across his face. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade, not drawing it, but close enough that the threat was clear. "I was only passing through," Alira said, forcing her voice to stay even. "I did not touch it." "You were close enough." Bram walked toward her, each footstep echoing off the stone walls. "No one comes to this wing. No one. Do you understand what happens to those who disobey that rule?" She did not know. Not exactly, but she had heard enough whispered fragments in the kitchens to guess it was nothing pleasant. She nodded quickly and let him escort her back through the winding halls of the castle, past tapestries older than memory, past windows that let in thin blades of moonlight. It had been only 3 days since she arrived at the stronghold of the Alpha Kings, hired on the recommendation of a traveling merchant who said the castle always needed hands willing to work hard and ask no questions. Alira had no family waiting for her anywhere, no home to return to if this position failed. She had accepted the offer within an hour of hearing it. What she had not expected was the pull. It happened the very first time she walked past the sealed wing, before anyone told her the rules, before she even knew the door existed. Something in her chest had tightened, like a string pulled taut between her ribs and that black iron door at the end of the forgotten hallway. She had stopped walking without meaning to. A fellow servant had grabbed her arm and hurried her along, whispering that the forbidden wing was not a place to linger. Now, 3 days later, she had wandered back to it again, drawn by the same invisible thread, and nearly been caught by the castle's most feared guard captain. "You are new," Bram said as they walked, his tone softening only slightly. "So I will tell you once, and only once. That door has not opened in 500 years. It was sealed by the first Alpha King himself, and every king since has sworn to protect it. No servant crosses that threshold. No noble, no soldier, not even the current king, enters that hallway without reason." "What is behind it?" Alira asked before she could stop herself. Bram's jaw tightened. "That is not a question you ask twice." They reached the servants' quarters, a long stone room lined with narrow beds and a single fireplace that struggled to warm the whole space. Bram left her at the doorway with a final warning glance, and Alira sank onto her cot, her pulse still racing. A girl named Marla, who had been kind to her since her first morning, looked up from mending a torn sleeve. "You went to the forbidden wing, didn't you?" Alira's silence was answer enough. "You are either very brave or very foolish," Marla said, though there was no judgment in her voice, only concern. "Half the servants who worked here before you were dismissed for going near that door out of curiosity. The other half never came back at all." "What do you mean, never came back?" Marla lowered her voice, glancing toward the door as if the walls themselves might be listening. "There are stories. Some say the king executes anyone who tries to open it. Others say the door itself does something to people who touch it without permission. No one knows for certain because no one who has gotten close enough to find out has ever spoken of it again." Alira wrapped her arms around herself, though the room was not cold. "Then why does it pull at me?" The question slipped out before she realized she had spoken it aloud. Marla's needle stopped moving. "What do you mean, pull at you?" Alira hesitated, unsure how to explain a feeling that made no sense even to herself. "When I am near it, something inside my chest tightens. Like there is a string connecting me to it. I have never felt anything like it before." Marla studied her for a long moment, an expression crossing her face that Alira could not quite name. Then she shook her head and returned to her mending. "You should not speak of such things, not here. Not where the guards or the other staff might hear. Keep your feelings to yourself, and stay away from that hallway. That is the only advice I can give you." Alira nodded, though the tightness in her chest had not eased. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay on her cot, listening to the soft breathing of the other servants, staring up at the stone ceiling, replaying the moment her hand had hovered near that iron door. She had felt something in that instant, something warm and aching, like a memory trying to surface from beneath still water. It made no sense. She had never been to this castle before in her life. She had no history here, no family, no reason to feel anything toward a door sealed centuries before she was born. And yet, the next morning, she was assigned to the kitchens, scrubbing pots and hauling water from the well in the courtyard. It was hard work, the kind that left her hands raw and her back aching by midday, but she welcomed the distraction. For a few hours, she managed to push the forbidden wing from her mind entirely. That changed the moment King Draven entered the Great Hall. She had heard about him constantly since her arrival, always in hushed, careful tones. The Alpha King, ruler of the stronghold, and every pack sworn to it. A man so composed and unreadable that even his most senior advisors chose their words around him like they were walking across thin ice. Some servants said they had never once seen him smile. Others claimed he had not raised his voice in years, not because he had no temper, but because he did not need to. A single look from him was enough to end an argument before it began. Elira had not expected to see him up close so soon, and certainly not while she was carrying a tray of bread through the corridor outside the Great Hall. He emerged from a side chamber flanked by two advisors, deep in conversation about border disputes with a neighboring pack, and she barely had time to step aside before he passed. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. It should have meant nothing. Servants and kings crossed paths in castles every day without incident. But something flickered across his face in that single moment, a flash of surprise so brief she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. His eyes, a deep and startling shade of amber, held hers for just a fraction too long before he turned away and continued down the corridor, as though nothing had happened. Elira stood frozen, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. "Move along," one of the advisors muttered, without even glancing at her, and she hurried on, her cheeks burning, for reasons she could not explain. That night, the dream came for the first time. She stood before the same black iron door, except in the dream it was not old and forgotten, it was new, its surface gleaming under torchlight, untouched by the centuries that had aged it in the waking world. A woman stood before it, her back turned, her shoulders shaking with quiet, broken sobs. Elira could not see her face, only long dark hair falling loose down her back, and a pale hand pressed flat against the iron, as though she were trying to hold the door shut through sheer will alone. The woman whispered a name, over and over, a name that dissolved the moment Elira tried to grasp it, slipping away like smoke between her fingers. There was so much grief in that whisper, so much longing, that Elira felt her own throat tighten in response, tears rising unbidden even though she did not understand what she was grieving for. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the taste of old sorrow still thick in her mouth. The room was dark and silent, the other servants asleep around her. She sat up slowly and glanced down at her wrist out of some instinct she could not name, though there was nothing there, nothing but pale skin in the moonlight filtering through the narrow window. Not yet. She did not sleep again that night. Instead, she lay awake turning the dream over in her mind, trying to make sense of a grief that felt far too personal to belong to a stranger, far too real to be nothing more than imagination. By the time dawn broke over the castle, she had made a quiet decision, one she did not dare speak aloud even to herself. She needed to know what was behind that door. The following days passed in a blur of chores and stolen glances toward the forbidden wing, whenever her duties carried her near enough to see it from a distance. She never approached again, not directly, not after her encounter with Bram, but she watched. She noticed things the other servants seemed not to notice at all, small details that nagged at her curiosity. The door's iron handle, worn smooth in a way that should not have been possible if no one had touched it in 500 years. The faint scent of something sweet and floral that lingered in that hallway, despite the layers of dust coating everything else. The way the castle's older staff crossed themselves, or muttered quiet words under their breath whenever they had reason to walk near that wing, as though passing a grave. She gathered these observations like pieces of a puzzle she did not yet understand, storing them away in the back of her mind while she scrubbed floors and carried water and served meals to nobles who never looked at her twice. King Draven, however, seemed to look at her more than once. It happened again 3 days later, in the courtyard this time, while she helped another servant carry firewood toward the kitchens. He was crossing the yard with Bram at his side, discussing something in low, clipped tones, and though he did not slow his pace or turn his head, Elira felt his gaze pass over her like a physical touch, quick and searching, there and gone, before she could be certain it had happened at all. That evening, Marla cornered her near the washing basins, her expression tight with worry. "The king has been asking about you," she said quietly. Alira nearly dropped the basin she was carrying. What do you mean, asking about me? He asked the head of household who the new girl was, the one who came 3 days before the incident in the Forbidden Wing. Marla's eyes searched hers, looking for something Alira could not identify. Alira, what happened between you and that door? Nothing happened. I told you, I never touched it. Then why does the king care who you are? Alira had no answer for that, none that made sense even to herself. She only knew that the tightness in her chest had not faded since her first day in the castle, that the dream of the weeping woman had returned twice more since that first night, each time a little clearer, each time leaving her more shaken than before, and that somewhere deep inside her, in a place she did not fully understand, something was waking up. She did not sleep well again that night, and in the darkness before dawn, she found herself thinking not of the door, but of the king's amber eyes, and the strange flicker of recognition she had seen in them, as though he too had felt something he could not explain. Whatever waited behind that sealed door, she was beginning to suspect it was not finished with her yet. The War Council chamber fell silent the moment King Draven slammed his palm against the stone table. I will not repeat myself, he said, his voice low and controlled, more dangerous for its calm than any shout could have been. The border patrols increase tonight. If Lord Varric's men cross into our territory again, they will be turned back by force. Around the table, a dozen advisors and pack lieutenants exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared argue. Draven had ruled the stronghold for nearly a decade, since the sudden death of his father left the throne to him far earlier than anyone had expected, and in that time, he had earned a reputation that made even seasoned warriors choose their words with care. He did not rage. He did not threaten twice. He simply decided, and the decision became law. Bram, seated near the king's right hand, cleared his throat carefully. My lord, there is also the matter of the sealed wing. The room's temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Draven's amber eyes flicked toward his captain, sharp and unreadable. What matter? A new servant came within reach of the door last week. I stopped her before anything happened, but... Bram hesitated, choosing his words with obvious caution. You asked about her afterward. I thought you should know that the staff have begun to talk. Let them talk. Draven's tone did not change, but something tightened behind his eyes, a flicker of tension that only someone who had served him for years would have recognized. The door has remained sealed for 5 centuries. It will remain sealed regardless of servant gossip. The council moved on to matters of trade and taxation, but Draven's attention drifted more than once during the remainder of the meeting, his mind circling back to a memory he could not quite dismiss. A servant girl in a corridor, a tray of bread trembling slightly in her hands, and a pair of eyes that had struck him with a force he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. He told himself it meant nothing. Servants passed through these halls by the dozens. There was no reason a single glance should have lodged itself so firmly in his thoughts that he found himself thinking of it during a council meeting about border security. And yet he did think of it, more than once, more than he liked. After the council dispersed, Draven retreated to his private study, a circular room at the top of the northern tower, lined with books collected over generations of Alpha Kings before him. It was the one place in the entire stronghold where he allowed himself to set aside the weight of leadership, if only for a short while. He poured himself a measure of dark wine and sat by the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds of the castle toward the mountains beyond. From this height, he could see almost the entire territory his family had ruled for 500 years, land his ancestors had fought and died to protect, land bound by an ancient vow that few outside his bloodline even knew existed. His father had told him the truth of the sealed door only once, on the night before Draven's coronation, in this very room. You will hear whispers about that wing for the rest of your life, his father had said, his voice heavier than Draven had ever heard it. Servants will invent stories. Nobles will speculate. Let them. The truth is not theirs to know, and it is not fully mine to explain either, because I do not fully understand it myself. Our bloodline is bound to guard that door until she returns. That is all I was told by my father, and all he was told by his father before him. Who is she? Young Draven had asked. His father had only shaken his head. I do not know. None of us have known. Not for 500 years. We only know that the vow must be kept, and that the door must remain sealed until the day it opens on its own, without force, without a key, guided only by the hand it was always meant to answer to. Draven had not thought much of the story in the years since, treating it as one more ancestral duty among the countless obligations that came with his crown, no different from collecting taxes or settling border disputes. The door was simply part of the castle's history, an old promise from a king long dead, kept out of tradition rather than belief. Until 3 days ago, when Bram had reported that a new servant had been found standing before that very door, close enough to touch it, drawn there for reasons she apparently could not explain even to herself. Draven set down his wine, frowning at the memory of her face. Wide, searching eyes, a stillness about her that seemed almost out of place among the usual nervous energy of new staff, and that flicker of recognition when their gazes had met in the corridor, so brief he had almost convinced himself it was nothing. Almost. He rose from his chair and crossed the study to a locked cabinet in the far corner, one he rarely opened. Inside lay a single object, wrapped in aged cloth that had once been fine silk but had faded to little more than gray fabric over the centuries. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small portrait, its paint cracked with age, depicting a woman with dark hair and an expression of quiet sorrow. His ancestor had commissioned this portrait, according to the notes tucked behind the frame, though of whom no one in the family had ever been entirely certain. Some believed it depicted the king's lost mate, the reason for the door's sealing in the first place. Others dismissed it as nothing more than an old painting of a forgotten noblewoman. Nowadays, Draven studied the portrait for a long moment, something uneasy stirring in his chest. The woman's features were faded, worn by time, but there was something in the shape of her face, the set of her eyes, that nagged at his memory in a way he could not fully place. He told himself he was imagining connections that did not exist. It would not be the first time. Exhaustion and the weight of ancestral duty had led his mind toward foolish conclusions. Still, he did not put the portrait away that night. He left it resting on his desk, and long after the candles had burned low, he found himself glancing at it again and again, comparing it against a memory of amber torchlight and startled eyes in a servant's corridor. The following morning, he summoned the head of household to his study, a stern older woman named Greta, who had managed the castle staff for over 20 years. "The new girl," he said without preamble, "the one who was found in the sealed wing last week." "Illyra, my lord," Greta answered, her expression carefully neutral, though Draven did not miss the flicker of curiosity behind her eyes. "She has been reassigned to kitchen duties, as you requested." "Has she caused any further trouble?" "None, my lord." "No. She works hard, keeps to herself, speaks little. The other servants say she seems troubled by dreams, though I cannot speak to the truth of that." Draven's grip on the edge of his desk tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dreams." Greta hesitated, clearly unsure whether this was information worth sharing. "It is only servant talk, my lord. I did not think it significant enough to report." "Report anything concerning that girl from now on," Draven said, his voice carrying an edge of command that left no room for argument. "Anything at all." Greta bowed and withdrew, leaving Draven alone with his thoughts once more. He stood at the window, looking out toward the forbidden wing, though it could not be seen from this angle of the tower, hidden as it was deep within the castle's oldest section. 500 years, his family had waited. 500 years of kings guarding a door none of them fully understood, protecting a vow made to a woman none of them had ever met, keeping faith with a promise that had outlived every one of the men who swore to honor it. He had never truly believed, not in his heart, that the vow would be fulfilled in his lifetime. It had always felt more like inherited duty than genuine expectation, a story passed down through generations that had gradually calcified into ritual, its original meaning worn smooth by the passage of centuries, much like the iron handle Bram had mentioned in his report. But now, for the first time since his father's death, Draven found himself wondering if the story might be more than ritual after all. He needed to see her again. Not as a king, observing a servant from a distance, but up close, where he could look into her eyes without the length of a corridor between them, and determine, once and for all, whether the flicker of recognition he had felt was real, or simply the product of an overtired mind searching for meaning where none existed. That evening, he found an excuse. The kitchens required inspection following a recent shipment of grain that had arrived, showing signs of spoilage, a task that would normally fall to a steward rather than the king himself. Draven went anyway, ignoring the surprised looks from the kitchen staff as he entered, his presence in that part of the castle rare enough to draw every eye in the room. He found her near the back, hauling a sack of flour toward the storage shelves, her sleeves rolled up and a smear of flour dusting one cheek. She did not notice him at first, too focused on her task, and for a moment he simply watched her, studying the shape of her face against the memory of the faded portrait still resting on his desk. The resemblance was there. Subtle, easy to dismiss as coincidence if he were looking for a reason to dismiss it, but present nonetheless, in the curve of her jaw, the set of her eyes. Then she looked up and saw him, and the sack of flour nearly slipped from her hands. "My lord," she said quickly, dropping into an unsteady bow, flour still smudged across her cheek. "Continue your work," he said, more gruffly than he intended. "I am only inspecting the grain stores." She nodded and returned to her task, though he noticed her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and he found himself unable to look away for longer than propriety allowed. Up close, the pull he had dismissed as imagination in the corridor returned tenfold, an inexplicable tightness in his chest that made no logical sense, that he could not have explained to Bram or Greta or anyone else in his court without sounding as though he had lost his senses entirely. He left the kitchens without another word, his mind racing, the faded portrait waiting for him in his study, like a question he was no longer certain he wanted answered. Whatever was happening, he could no longer convince himself it was nothing. "He came into the kitchens himself," Marla whispered that night, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The king never inspects grain stores, never. That is a steward's task." Alira sat on the edge of her cot, still shaken from the encounter, the memory of his amber eyes lingering in her mind long after he had left the kitchens. Perhaps he simply wanted to see the spoiled grain. "Alira." Marla's voice dropped even lower, barely audible over the soft breathing of the other sleeping servants. "The king does not simply want things. Everything he does has a reason, and usually more than one. If he came to see you, it was because he wanted to see you." "That is absurd. Why would the Alpha King want anything to do with a kitchen servant?" Marla did not answer immediately, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Alira had not heard from her before. "There are stories about that door, Alira, older than any of us. My grandmother worked in this castle before me, and her grandmother before her, and the story has passed down through every generation of servants who ever worked these halls. They say the first Alpha King loved a woman so deeply that when he lost her, he sealed away the room where they had spent their happiest years together, unable to bear looking at it. They say he made a vow, one that bound every king after him, that the door would remain closed until she returned. Returned from where? No one knows. Some say from death itself, through some manner of rebirth. Others say it is only a story, a legend, meant to explain why the door has never been touched in 5 centuries. Nothing more than a convenient tale. Alira wrapped her arms around herself, though the room was not cold. "And you think the king believes I have something to do with this legend?" "I think," Marla said carefully, "that the door has never opened for anyone in 500 years, and that within days of your arrival, you were found standing before it, drawn there by something you could not explain. I think the king has never once inspected the kitchens in the years I have worked here, and today he came specifically to see you. I do not know what any of it means, Alira, but I do not think it is nothing." Sleep did not come easily again that night, and when it finally did, the dream returned, more vivid than before. The weeping woman stood before the door once more, her hand pressed against the cold iron, her shoulders shaking, with silent sobs. This time, Alira found herself standing closer than before, close enough to see the edge of the woman's profile as she turned slightly, close enough to catch a glimpse of dark hair and a tear-streaked cheek before the dream dissolved into mist. "I will wait," the woman whispered, her voice raw with grief. "However long it takes, I will wait." Alira woke with those words echoing in her mind, her pillow damp beneath her cheek, though she could not remember crying in her sleep. She sat up slowly in the darkness, glancing toward her wrist, out of the same strange instinct that had gripped her before, and this time, for just a moment, in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, she thought she saw something. A faint shimmer against her skin, gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. She did not sleep again that night. The following days passed with an unsettling quiet that felt more like the stillness before a storm than genuine calm. Illyra threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors and hauling water, and kneading bread until her muscles ached and her mind grew too tired to dwell on dreams and doors and kings who inspected grain stores without reason. It did not work as well as she had hoped. She found herself noticing small things throughout the castle that she had never paid attention to before, details that seemed to gather significance the longer she thought about them. The way certain older tapestries depicted a king standing beside a woman whose face had been deliberately obscured, the fabric worn thin in that exact spot, as though someone had tried to scratch away the image entirely. The way the castle's oldest stonework, near the base of the forbidden wing, bore faint carvings that resembled a woman's profile, weathered nearly smooth by centuries of exposure. She mentioned none of this to Marla, unsure how to explain observations that felt less like curiosity and more like pieces of a memory, struggling to surface from somewhere she could not name. On the 5th day after the king's visit to the kitchens, Illyra was summoned by Greta, the head of household, to help prepare the great hall for a visiting delegation from a neighboring pack. It was tedious work, polishing silver and arranging place settings under Greta's exacting supervision, but it kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, which she welcomed after days of restless unease. It was during this work that she overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. Two of the castle's senior advisors stood near the entrance to the hall, their voices low, but not quite low enough to escape her notice, as she polished a nearby candelabra. "The king has been distracted all week," one of them murmured, "ever since the incident in the Forbidden Wing." "You think the girl means something," the second advisor replied, his tone skeptical. "A servant, wandering too close to a sealed door. It happens more often than you would think. Curiosity is not prophecy." "Perhaps, but Bram tells me the king asked Greta to report anything unusual about her. Dreams, of all things. Since when does the Alpha King concern himself with a kitchen servant's dreams? Since he remembered the old vow, I would wager. Every king since the first has carried that burden, whether or not they believed in it. Draven is no different, whatever face he shows the court. If the legend is true—" "It is not our place to speculate on legends," the first advisor interrupted sharply, glancing around the hall as though suddenly aware of how far his voice might carry. "Keep such thoughts to yourself. If the king wishes to share his reasoning, he will do so in his own time." The two men moved off toward the far end of the hall, their conversation shifting to the matter of the visiting delegation, and Illyra remained frozen by the candelabra, her heart pounding, the polishing cloth forgotten in her hand. The vow, the legend, dreams the king had specifically asked to be informed of. It was no longer possible to convince herself that her connection to the sealed door was mere coincidence, an overactive imagination reacting to old castle folklore. Something was happening, something larger than she understood, and she was somehow at the center of it, though she could not begin to guess why. That evening, as she helped clear the last of the polishing supplies from the great hall, she found herself alone for a rare moment, the other servants having already moved on to their next tasks. She glanced toward the corridor that led, through a winding path she had come to know without meaning to, toward the Forbidden Wing. She should not go. She knew that. Bram's warning still echoed in her memory, and after everything she had overheard today, the stakes felt higher than ever before. And yet the pull remained, steady and insistent, a thread drawing her forward no matter how firmly she told herself to walk in the opposite direction. She did not go that night. She forced herself back to the servants' quarters, back to her cot, back to the safety of routine, though sleep offered little peace, filled as it was with fragments of the weeping woman's voice and the faint, aching shimmer she thought she had glimpsed on her own wrist. But she knew, with a certainty that settled somewhere deep in her chest, that it was only a matter of time before the pull became too strong to resist. Something was waiting for her behind that door. Something that had been waiting for 500 years. And whether she was ready or not, it seemed the waiting was finally coming to an end. The mark appeared fully 3 nights later, and Illyra nearly screamed when she saw it. She had woken in the gray hour before dawn, her skin damp with sweat from another dream of the weeping woman, and when she pushed back her sleeve to splash water on her face from the basin beside her cot, she saw it clearly for the first time. A delicate pattern etched into the skin of her inner wrist, resembling the shape of an old iron key, intertwined with a single blooming flower, glowing faintly silver in the dim light, before fading to nothing more than a pale outline as the sun began to rise. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath caught in her throat, before yanking her sleeve back down and glancing around the room to see if anyone else had noticed. The other servants slept on, undisturbed, and Marla's cot beside hers remained empty of any sign that she had witnessed the moment. Alira spent the rest of the morning in a daze, her thoughts consumed by the mark hidden beneath her sleeve, so distracted that she nearly dropped an entire tray of dishes while serving breakfast to a table of visiting nobles. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes, frowned at her clumsiness, and Alira mumbled an apology before hurrying from the hall, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and fear in equal measure. She found Marla in the laundry room during the midday break, sorting linens with practiced efficiency, and pulled her aside the moment they were alone. "I need to show you something," Alira whispered, glancing toward the door to ensure no one else was near. "But you cannot tell anyone, please." Marla's expression shifted from curiosity to concern as Alira pushed back her sleeve, revealing the faint silvery outline still visible on her wrist in the daylight, though far dimmer now than it had appeared before dawn. "What is that?" Marla breathed, reaching out but stopping just short of touching it, as though some instinct warned her against contact. "I do not know. It appeared this morning, after the dream. It glowed, Marla. I am not imagining it. It glowed like moonlight." Marla's face had gone pale. "Alira, that mark. I have seen something like it before, in an old book kept in the castle archives, a history of the founding of this stronghold, written not long after the first Alpha King's reign. There was an illustration, very faded, showing a similar pattern on the wrist of a woman in the king's court." "The woman from the legend?" "I do not know for certain. The book did not name her clearly, but the pattern, Alira, it is nearly identical to what you are describing." Alira pulled her sleeve back down, her hands trembling. "What does it mean?" "I do not know that either, but I think," Marla said slowly, choosing her words with obvious care, "that you need to speak with someone who might. Not me. I am only a servant, same as you. But perhaps the castle archivist, old Master Corwin. He has spent his entire life studying the history of this stronghold. If anyone could explain what that mark means, it would be him." That afternoon, Alira found an excuse to visit the castle archives, claiming she had been sent to deliver a message from the kitchens, a lie she felt guilty for the moment she spoke it. The archives occupied a quiet corner of the castle's eastern wing, rows of towering shelves filled with books and scrolls dating back centuries, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and dust. Master Corwin, a thin man with silver hair and spectacles perched low on his nose, looked up from his desk with mild surprise as she entered. "Kitchen staff rarely have reason to visit these halls. What brings you here, child?" Alira hesitated, unsure how to begin, before deciding that honesty, however risky, was her best option. "I wanted to ask you about the legend of the sealed door, the one in the forbidden wing." Corwin's expression shifted immediately, his earlier mild surprise replaced by something sharper, more guarded. He set down his quill and studied her carefully. "That is an unusual question for a kitchen servant to ask." "I know. I am sorry if it is inappropriate. I have heard fragments of the story, and I found myself curious." The old archivist was quiet for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as though he were weighing something in his mind. Finally, he gestured toward a chair near his desk. "Sit then. I will tell you what I know, though I warn you, much of it is fragmentary. 500 years is a long time, and even the most careful records grow incomplete." Alira sat, her heart pounding, as Corwin retrieved a heavy, leather-bound volume from a nearby shelf, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "The first Alpha King of this stronghold," Corwin began, "was a warrior named Aldrich, who united the scattered packs of this territory under a single banner, through both strength and diplomacy in equal measure. He is remembered as a great ruler, but the records also speak of a woman at his side, a woman the histories name only as his mate, without ever recording her true name." He turned the book toward Alira, revealing a faded illustration much like the one Marla had described. A woman standing beside a crowned figure, her wrist marked with a pattern Alira recognized with a jolt of cold recognition. According to the records, Corwin continued, she vanished under circumstances the histories describe only as tragic, without further detail. Some believe she died, others believe she was taken from him by forces beyond his control. Whatever the truth, King Aldrich sealed away the chamber where they had lived together and made a vow before his entire court, one recorded here, in the archives, almost word for word. He turned to another page, and Alira leaned forward to read the faded script, her breath catching in her throat. I will guard this door until she returns to open it herself, however long the wait, however many generations must pass. My bloodline shall carry this vow until it is fulfilled. And no one has opened it since, Alira said quietly. Not in 500 years. Corwin closed the book slowly, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. You said you heard fragments of this story. May I ask where? Alira hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, before deciding she had already come too far to hold back entirely. She pushed back her sleeve and showed him the mark on her wrist, still faintly visible, even in the dim light of the archives. Corwin went very still. It appeared 3 nights ago, Alira said, her voice barely above a whisper. After a dream. I have had the same dream several times now, of a woman weeping before the sealed door. The old archivist rose slowly from his chair, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, and retrieved a small, weathered scroll he handled with visible reverence. He unrolled it carefully on the desk, revealing another illustration, this one showing the mark in far greater detail than the one in the history book. This scroll was never meant to be part of the general archive, he said quietly. It was passed down separately, through the line of court historians, rather than kept with the public records, precisely because of what it describes. It speaks of a mark that would appear on the woman's wrist when she returned, a sign that the vow was nearing its fulfillment. Alira's hands trembled as she looked at the illustration, identical in every detail to the mark now etched into her own skin. Child, Corwin said, his voice gentle but urgent, you must understand the weight of what you are describing. If this mark is genuine, and I confess I have no reason to doubt what I am seeing, then you are at the center of something far larger than either of us fully understands. The king must be told. No, Alira said quickly, panic rising in her chest. Please, not yet. I do not understand any of this myself. I do not know what it means, or why it is happening to me. I need time. Corwin studied her for a long moment, sympathy softening his sharp features. I understand your fear, but I must warn you, Alira. Secrets of this magnitude rarely remain hidden for long, not within these walls. The king already suspects something. Bram's report of your presence near the sealed door, his subsequent inquiries about you, these are not idle curiosities. If you do not go to him, I fear circumstances may force the truth into the open, regardless of your wishes. Alira left the archives that evening with more questions than answers, the weight of Corwin's warning pressing heavily on her thoughts. She returned to her duties in a daze, barely registering the tasks in front of her, her mind consumed by the illustration of the mark, identical to her own, and the ancient vow recorded in ink faded nearly to nothing. 500 years, an entire bloodline of kings, waiting for a promise she apparently carried, without ever having chosen to. That night, as she lay on her cot staring up at the stone ceiling, she made a decision that frightened her more than anything else had since her arrival at the castle. She would go to the door herself. Not by accident this time, not drawn there by instinct she did not understand, but deliberately, with full knowledge of what she might find. If the mark on her wrist meant what Corwin's scroll suggested, then perhaps she owed it to whatever truth waited behind that iron door, to finally uncover it herself, before fear or circumstance took the choice away from her entirely. She did not know when the opportunity would come, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it would come soon. The opportunity arrived far sooner than Alira expected, and in a manner she could never have planned herself. 3 days after her conversation with Master Corwin, Greta assigned the kitchen staff a rotation of deep cleaning duties throughout the older sections of the castle, preparing for an upcoming ceremony that would bring nobles from every allied pack to the stronghold. Alira had expected to be assigned somewhere ordinary, the servants' hall perhaps, or the guest chambers on the second floor. Instead, her name appeared on the list beside the eastern corridor, the very hallway that led toward the forbidden wing. She stared at the parchment posted outside the kitchen for a long moment, certain there had been some mistake, before Greta's voice cut through her confusion. "The eastern corridor only, Alira," the older woman said briskly, checking names off a separate list in her hand. "Sweep and dust as far as the iron gate. You are not to cross beyond it under any circumstances. Bram will be posted nearby to ensure the boundary is respected." Alira nodded, her heart already beginning to race, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She gathered her cleaning supplies and made her way toward the eastern corridor as instructed, broom and cloth in hand, trying to steady her breathing with every step. The corridor was exactly as she remembered from her first days at the castle, dim and cool, the air heavy with the particular stillness of a space rarely disturbed. She began her work methodically, sweeping the stone floor, wiping dust from the old tapestries lining the walls, gradually making her way toward the iron gate that marked the boundary of the forbidden wing. Bram was not there. She noticed his absence with a jolt of surprise, glancing around the empty corridor, as though he might simply be standing somewhere just out of sight. But the hallway remained empty, silent except for the soft whisper of her broom against stone, and after several minutes of uncertain waiting, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that some other duty had called him away, if only briefly. She should have retreated immediately, she knew that. Every warning she had received since her arrival told her to finish her assigned task and leave the boundary undisturbed until Bram returned to his post. Instead, she found herself walking closer to the iron gate, drawn by the same invisible thread that had pulled at her since her very first day in this castle, stronger now than ever before, as though the mark on her wrist had become a living thing, tugging her forward with quiet, insistent urgency. The gate was not locked. She discovered this with a small, disbelieving breath, as her hand closed around the cold metal bars, and they swung open without resistance, hinges silent, despite 5 centuries of disuse. Beyond the gate, the hallway narrowed, leading toward the black iron door she had seen only once before, from a distance, in the brief moments before Bram had caught her and escorted her away. Now she stood before it fully, close enough to touch, the worn handle exactly as Marla had described, smoothed by an unseen hand across 500 years. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her own ears. Every instinct told her to turn back, to return to her broom and her cloth and her assigned duties before anyone discovered how far she had strayed. But the pull in her chest had become overwhelming, a physical ache that seemed to draw her forward with a will of its own, and beneath her sleeve, she felt a warmth spreading across her wrist that could only be the mark, responding to something she did not fully understand. She pushed back her sleeve and looked down at it, watching in silent wonder as the silvery pattern began to glow, brighter than it had on any previous night, pulsing gently in time with her racing heartbeat. "Please," she whispered, though she could not have said to whom, or what she was asking for. "Please let me understand." She pressed her palm flat against the cold iron of the door. For a moment, nothing happened, and she felt a sharp stab of disappointment mixed with relief, as though some part of her had hoped the mystery might simply resolve itself, without requiring her to take this final, irreversible step. Then the metal beneath her palm grew warm. She gasped, nearly pulling her hand away, but something held her in place, an instinct deeper than fear, deeper than caution, urging her to remain exactly where she was. The warmth spread outward from her palm, tracing intricate patterns across the door's surface that glowed faintly silver, matching the light still pulsing from the mark on her wrist. A low groan echoed through the corridor, ancient hinges protesting after 5 centuries of stillness, and Alira stumbled backward as the massive iron door began, slowly and impossibly, to swing open. Golden light spilled out from within, warm and impossibly bright against the dim stone corridor, illuminating her stunned face as she stared into a chamber that had not seen a single visitor in 500 years. She stood frozen at the threshold, torn between overwhelming wonder and a fear so deep it left her hands trembling at her sides. Whatever waited inside that room, whatever truth had been sealed away for 5 centuries, she was about to become the first person in living memory to see it. Behind her, distant footsteps echoed through the corridor, growing rapidly closer, and she recognized the heavy, purposeful stride, even before she turned to look. Someone had felt the door open. Someone was coming. But it was too late to close it again. Too late to pretend this moment had not happened. Elira took a steadying breath and stepped across the threshold into 500 years of silence, the golden light closing softly around her like an embrace long overdue. The chamber inside took her breath away. Unlike the dust and decay she had expected from a room sealed for 500 years, everything before her looked untouched by time, as though the door had closed only yesterday, rather than across 5 centuries of history. A grand hall stretched before her, its stone floor polished smooth, tall windows along one wall admitting soft golden light despite the late hour outside, light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, warm and gentle rather than harsh. At the far end stood 2 thrones, carved from pale stone and lined with cushions that showed no sign of fading or wear, one clearly meant for a king, the other smaller, more delicate, meant for someone who had sat beside him as an equal, rather than a subject. Elira walked forward slowly, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast stillness, drawn toward a wall lined with portraits she had not expected to find. The first showed a broad-shouldered man with dark hair and a commanding presence, dressed in the ceremonial armor of an Alpha King, his expression stern, but not unkind. She recognized him instantly from the illustrations in Corwin's history book. King Aldrich, the first Alpha King, founder of this stronghold, sealer of this very door. Beside his portrait hung another, and Elira's breath caught painfully in her throat as she looked upon it. The woman in the painting wore a gown of deep blue, her dark hair falling loose past her shoulders, her expression caught somewhere between quiet joy and the faintest shadow of sorrow, as though the artist had captured a single fleeting moment of happiness, threaded through with something more fragile underneath. It was her own face. Not similar, not merely resembling. Her own face, painted by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago, staring back at her from a portrait 500 years old. Elira pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, staggering back a step, as the room seemed to tilt around her. She had suspected something like this since her conversation with Corwin, some connection between herself and the woman of legend, but seeing it laid out so plainly, so undeniably, struck her with a force she had not been prepared for. "It cannot be," she whispered, though her own voice sounded distant in her ears. She moved closer to the wall, her eyes catching on words carved into the stone beneath the portraits, the same vow Corwin had shown her in his history book, but rendered here, in far greater detail, the king's own hand having apparently overseen its inscription. "To my beloved, taken from me before our story could be finished, I make this vow before all who bear witness. This chamber shall remain as it was on our happiest day, untouched by time, waiting for the moment you return to me. My bloodline shall guard this door, generation after generation, until you cross this threshold once more. However long the wait, however many centuries must pass, I will not break this promise. Come home, and find everything exactly as you left it." Tears spilled freely down Elira's cheeks before she even realized she was crying, an overwhelming grief rising in her chest that felt both foreign and painfully familiar, as though echoes of a sorrow that was not entirely her own had finally found their way to the surface after 500 years of silence. She thought of the dreams, the weeping woman standing before this very door, whispering a name she could never quite grasp. She thought of the mark on her wrist, glowing silver in the darkness, responding to a vow made centuries before her birth. She was not simply connected to this legend. She was somehow, impossibly, its center. Footsteps thundered through the corridor behind her, and Elira turned just as King Draven appeared at the threshold, his expression a storm of emotions she had never seen him display before. Fury and disbelief, and something rawer beneath both, something that looked almost like fear. "How," he demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled shock, "did you open this door?" Elira could not find words immediately, standing frozen between the portraits and the king's furious gaze, tears still wet on her cheeks. She raised her trembling wrist instead, pushing back her sleeve to reveal the mark, still glowing faintly silver in the golden light of the chamber. Draven's eyes fell to her wrist, and whatever fury had driven him through the corridor seemed to drain from his face all at once, replaced by something closer to disbelief, so profound, it left him momentarily unable to speak. He crossed the threshold slowly, his gaze moving from her wrist to her face, and then, almost involuntarily, toward the portrait hanging on the wall behind her. Alira watched him take in the resemblance, watched the last of his composure crack as understanding dawned in his amber eyes. "That is not possible," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier authority, reduced to something quiet and uncertain. 500 years. It has been 500 years. "I do not understand any of this," Alira said, her own voice trembling. "I did not choose this. I do not even know who I truly am, or why any of this is happening to me. I only know that something has been pulling me toward this door since the moment I arrived at this castle, and I could not ignore it any longer." Draven's gaze remained fixed on her, searching her face as though trying to reconcile the servant girl he had watched carry flour sacks in the kitchens with the woman in the portrait beside them, painted by an ancestor who had died believing his vow might never be fulfilled. "My family has guarded this door for 5 centuries, he said slowly, waiting for a promise none of us truly believed would come to pass in our lifetime. I did not believe it either. Not fully. Not until 3 weeks ago, when a new servant was found standing before this very threshold, drawn here by something she could not explain." He stepped closer, and Alira found she could not retreat, held in place by something in his expression that had shifted from fury to something far more fragile, something that made her chest ache in response. "Tell me your name again," he said quietly. "Your full name." "Alira. Only Alira. I have no family name. I was found as a child, with no memory of where I came from." Something flickered across Draven's face at those words, a recognition he did not voice aloud, though Alira saw it clearly enough. He glanced once more toward the portrait, toward the woman whose face matched hers so precisely it could not be coincidence, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire chamber. 500 years, my bloodline has waited for a vow I never expected to see fulfilled." He met her eyes directly, amber meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I do not know what this means for either of us, Alira. But I know that door has not opened for anyone in 5 centuries, and it opened for you tonight, without force, without a key, exactly as the old records said it would." The golden light of the chamber seemed to pulse gently around them, as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting alongside them both for whatever came next. Bram arrived moments later, skidding to a halt at the threshold of the chamber, his sword half drawn before he registered the scene before him, and slowly, uncertainly, lowered it back into its sheath. "My lord," he said, his eyes darting between Draven and Alira with open astonishment. "The door, I felt it open from the far end of the corridor. I came as quickly as I could." "Seal the corridor," Draven said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority, though Alira could still hear the undercurrent of shock beneath it. "No one enters this wing, until I say otherwise. Not staff, not council, not visiting delegates. Do you understand me, Bram?" "Yes, my lord, but—" Bram hesitated, glancing again at Alira with an expression that mixed confusion and dawning realization. "The girl. She opened it. How?" "That is not a matter for discussion tonight," Draven said firmly. "See to the corridor." Bram bowed and withdrew, though Alira did not miss the lingering look he cast over his shoulder, before disappearing back down the hallway, a look that suggested the castle's guard captain understood, at least in part, what he had just witnessed. Once they were alone again, Draven turned back to Alira, his expression settling into something more controlled, though the tension in his shoulders remained visible even to her untrained eye. "You should not have come here," he said, though the words carried none of the harshness they might have held days earlier. "This wing has been forbidden for 5 centuries for good reason." "I know," Alira said quietly. "I did not fully intend to. I only meant to finish my cleaning duties in the corridor, but the pull became too strong to resist. I am sorry, my lord. If I have caused trouble, I do not understand." Draven studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, the sharp authority of the Alpha King giving way, briefly, to something more uncertain, more human. "You have caused no trouble that was not already 500 years in the making. This is not your doing, Alira. If anything, you have simply revealed a truth my bloodline has waited generations to see confirmed." He gestured toward the portraits on the wall, his gaze lingering on the image of King Aldrich, before shifting toward the woman beside him. the resemblance to Illyra undeniable in the golden light. My ancestor made a vow before this entire chamber existed as it does now, sealed away and preserved exactly as it was, on what the records describe as their happiest day together. He believed, or perhaps hoped, that the woman he lost would somehow return to him, though I do not think even he fully understood how such a thing might be possible. Reincarnation, some manner of rebirth across centuries. No king before me has ever claimed to fully understand the mechanism behind the vow, only that it existed, and that it was to be honored regardless of belief. And you believe I am her, Illyra said softly. Some version of her, returned after 500 years. I do not know what to believe, Draven admitted, an honesty in his voice that surprised her, given everything she had heard about his usual composure. I have ruled this stronghold for nearly a decade, and in that time, I have made countless decisions based on logic, on strategy, on the practical realities of leading a territory surrounded by rival packs. I have never had reason to place faith in old legends passed down through generations of kings who may have simply wanted to believe their ancestors' grief had not been in vain. He paused, his gaze drifting once more toward the portrait, and when he continued, his voice had grown quieter still. But I cannot explain the mark on your wrist. I cannot explain how this door opened for you, when it has remained sealed against every other hand for 5 centuries, and I cannot explain why, from the very first moment I saw you in that corridor weeks ago, I felt something I have not felt in longer than I care to admit. Illyra's heart pounded at his words, uncertain how to respond, caught between the overwhelming strangeness of the entire situation and something deeper stirring beneath her fear, something that felt disturbingly close to recognition. What happens now? She asked finally. Draven was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give every decision as king. I do not know, he admitted. This has never happened before, not in 500 years of waiting. There is no precedent for what comes next, no ancestral guidance beyond the vow itself. He looked at her directly, his amber eyes steady despite the uncertainty in his voice. But I know that this chamber has waited 5 centuries to be opened again, and it opened for you. I know that my family's vow was made to honor a promise of return, and whatever you are, whoever you once were, that promise has been fulfilled tonight, in a manner none of my ancestors ever witnessed. Illyra looked around the chamber once more, at the untouched thrones, the portraits preserved as though painted only yesterday, the carved vow that had waited 500 years for someone to finally read it and understand its meaning. Whatever she had been before arriving at this castle, whoever she had been born as, with no memory of her own history, something ancient and significant had clearly been waiting for her within these walls. I do not know how to be whoever they believe I am, she said quietly, gesturing toward the portrait, toward the vow, toward 5 centuries of expectation she had never asked to carry. I am only a servant, my lord. I have no memory of any life before the one I have lived these past weeks. Then perhaps, Draven said, something gentler entering his voice than she had heard from him before, we discover the truth together, rather than assuming we already understand it. The golden light of the chamber seemed to settle around them both, warm and steady, as though the room itself approved of this fragile beginning, 500 years of waiting finally giving way to something neither of them could yet fully name. News of the sealed door traveled through the castle faster than any formal announcement could have managed, despite Draven's order that the corridor remain closed to staff. By the following morning, whispers filled every hallway, every kitchen corner, every washing room where servants gathered to share fragments of information gleaned from Bram's tight-lipped guards or overheard conversations among the household staff. Illyra felt the weight of those whispers the moment she stepped into the kitchens, dozens of eyes turning toward her with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something closer to awe that made her deeply uncomfortable. Marla found her within minutes, pulling her into a quiet corner near the storage pantry. They are saying you opened the sealed door, Marla whispered, her eyes wide, that the king himself came running when he felt it open. Illyra, is it true? Illyra nodded slowly, unable to find words adequate to explain everything she had witnessed the night before. The portraits, the vow carved into stone, the overwhelming grief that had risen in her chest at the sight of her own face, painted 5 centuries before her birth. Before Marla could press further, one of Greta's assistants appeared at the pantry door, informing Alira that she was summoned immediately to the king's private study, a request that sent a fresh wave of anxious whispers rippling through the kitchen staff within earshot. She followed the assistant through unfamiliar corridors of the castle, sections she had never had reason to visit as a kitchen servant, until they reached the base of the northern tower. Draven waited for her there, along with Master Corwin, the old archivist, looking simultaneously exhausted and electrified, with the kind of excitement Alira imagined scholars rarely experienced outside of significant historical discoveries. "Elira," Draven said, gesturing for her to enter the circular study, "I asked Corwin to join us. He has spent decades researching the history surrounding the vow, and I believe there is more you deserve to understand before we decide how to proceed." Corwin greeted her with a respectful nod that felt strange coming from a man who had, only days earlier, addressed her as a curious kitchen servant, rather than the central figure of a 500-year-old legend. He gestured toward a chair near the king's desk, upon which rested the faded portrait Alira recognized from Draven's locked cabinet, the same weathered painting of the weeping woman she had glimpsed once before, without fully understanding its significance. "I have spent the morning cross-referencing every record I could find related to the founding of this stronghold," Corwin began, spreading several aged documents across the desk. "The most complete account comes from the personal journal of King Aldric's younger brother, Prince Rowan, who documented much of his brother's reign in considerable detail." He selected one particular page, its ink faded nearly to illegibility in places, and read carefully from the portions that remained clear enough to interpret. According to Prince Rowan's account, King Aldric's mate was not born into nobility. She arrived at the stronghold as a healer, summoned to treat wounded soldiers following a significant battle against a rival territory. The king, wounded himself during that same conflict, was among those she treated, and according to the journal, their bond formed quickly, despite the vast difference in their stations. Alira listened intently, something in the description stirring a strange familiarity she could not fully explain, though she had certainly never encountered these details before in her life. "The journal describes their happiness together in considerable detail across several years," Corwin continued, before an entry describes what Prince Rowan refers to only as a great tragedy, without specifying its nature. "The king's mate vanished, according to the account, during a diplomatic journey to a neighboring territory, and despite extensive searches, she was never found." Prince Rowan's later entries describe his brother's grief as consuming, a sorrow that never fully lifted for the remainder of his reign. "He never remarried," Draven added quietly. "Every historical record confirms that. He ruled for another 30 years after her disappearance, and never took another mate, despite considerable pressure from his advisors, to secure the succession through marriage. He sealed this chamber and made the vow shortly after her disappearance, apparently unwilling to accept that she was truly gone." Alira absorbed this information slowly, her chest aching with a grief that felt strangely personal, despite belonging, by all logical accounts, to a woman who had died 5 centuries before her own birth. "You believe I am her, reborn, somehow, after all this time?" "I believe," Corwin said carefully, "that whatever mechanism governs the vow, whatever force bound this door and this mark to a promise of eventual return, it has manifested in you, with a clarity that cannot easily be dismissed as coincidence. Whether that constitutes rebirth in the traditional sense, or something else entirely that our historical understanding is simply insufficient to explain, I cannot say with certainty. 500 years is a long span for any legend to survive intact, and much may have been lost or altered in the retelling across so many generations." "But the mark," Draven said, "and the door itself, these are not things that can be easily dismissed as legend or coincidence. The mark matches historical illustrations, preserved, specifically because they described a sign that would herald fulfillment of the vow. The door opened for Alira, and Alira alone, despite 5 centuries of countless hands, servants and nobles, and kings among them, who never once managed to move it so much as an inch." Alira sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything she had learned, the shape of a life she had never lived, slowly forming around her like a garment cut for someone else's body, a fit that felt both foreign and unnervingly familiar all at once. "What does this mean for me now?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I came to this castle as a servant, with no memory of my past. I did not ask to become the center of a 500-year-old vow. I do not know how to be whoever your ancestor loved and lost. No one is asking you to become her, Draven said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it, a marked contrast to the composed authority he displayed before his court. You are Alira. Whatever connection exists between you and the woman in that portrait, whatever thread of history binds your fate to my family's vow, you remain your own person, shaped by your own experiences, your own choices. I would not ask you to erase yourself in service of fulfilling an ancestor's promise. Then what do you ask? Alira said, meeting his gaze directly, searching for honesty in his expression, rather than the careful diplomacy she suspected a king might default to in such circumstances. Draven was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she had not expected from a man renowned throughout his court for his unshakable composure. I ask only that you allow us to discover the truth together, without either of us assuming we already understand what this connection means, or where it might lead. The vow has waited 500 years for this moment. It can wait a while longer for us to understand it properly, rather than rushing toward conclusions neither of us are yet prepared to accept. Corwin gathered his documents quietly, offering a respectful bow before withdrawing from the study, leaving Draven and Alira alone, amid the weight of 5 centuries finally beginning to settle into something resembling clarity, however incomplete it remained. Outside the tower window, the castle continued its ordinary rhythms, oblivious to the magnitude of what had unfolded within these walls, though Alira suspected, with a growing sense of unease, that ordinary rhythms would not remain undisturbed for very much longer. Word of the sealed door's opening would not stay contained within the castle for long, and she could not yet guess what consequences might follow once it reached ears beyond these walls, among nobles and rival packs who had waited generations for any excuse to challenge the strength of the Alpha King's bloodline. Lord Varric arrived at the stronghold 8 days later, uninvited and unannounced, at the head of a small procession that made no attempt to disguise its purpose. Alira watched from an upper window as the visiting lord dismounted in the courtyard below, his expression carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed he had arrived with leverage no one could easily dismiss. Bram met him at the gates with visible tension, and though Alira could not hear their exchange from this distance, the stiffness in the guard captain's posture told her enough. He has heard the rumors, Marla said beside her, having joined Alira at the window during a rare break from their duties. Everyone has heard the rumors by now, Alira. It was foolish to think something like this could remain contained within castle walls. Alira said nothing, watching as Draven emerged to greet the visiting lord with the same composed authority she had witnessed in the War Council weeks earlier, though she noticed a new tightness around his eyes that suggested this particular visit troubled him more than most. She learned the reason for that tension later that evening, when Draven summoned her once again to his private study, his expression grave in a way she had not seen since the night the sealed door first opened. Lord Varric has requested a formal audience, he said without preamble, pacing slowly before the window rather than sitting at his usual place behind the desk. He claims to have heard troubling reports about instability within my court, specifically regarding matters of succession and the legitimacy of my rule. What does that have to do with me? Alira asked, though a cold, sinking feeling in her stomach suggested she already understood the answer. Varric has long resented the strength of my bloodline's claim over this territory, Draven said, his jaw tight. His family has contested our position for generations, though never with sufficient support among the other packs to mount any serious challenge. If word has reached him that a servant with no known lineage opened a door sealed for 5 centuries by ancient vow, and that the current king has taken personal interest in her, he will not see a fulfilled promise, Alira. He will see an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To claim that my judgment has been compromised, to suggest that a king, distracted by legend and superstition, elevating a servant of unknown origin to some position of significance within his court, is a king, unfit to lead a territory that depends on strength and stability, to survive among rival packs. Draven's hands clenched at his sides, frustration evident beneath his controlled exterior. He will use this as a weapon, regardless of the truth behind it, because the perception of weakness is often more dangerous than weakness itself. Alira absorbed this with growing unease, understanding for the first time the true scope of what her presence had set into motion. She had thought, in the days since the chamber's discovery, primarily of her own confusion, her own struggle to reconcile a servant's ordinary life with the extraordinary weight of a 500-year-old vow. She had not fully considered the political consequences that might ripple outward from her actions, threatening the stability of an entire territory she had only recently come to call home. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. "I do not yet know," Draven admitted, an honesty that seemed to cost him something to voice aloud. "Varric will press for a formal audience before the full court, an opportunity to raise his concerns publicly, rather than through private diplomatic channels. If I refuse, he will claim I have something to hide. If I grant it, I risk exposing you to scrutiny and hostility from nobles who will see only a servant girl elevated beyond her station, without understanding or caring about the truth of the vow that binds us." The following days passed in a tense blur of preparation, Draven consulting privately with Bram and his senior advisors, while Alira found herself caught in an uncomfortable limbo, no longer treated entirely as an ordinary kitchen servant by the staff, who now regarded her with wary curiosity, yet not formally acknowledged in any capacity that might explain her sudden relevance to matters of court politics. Marla remained her only true confidant during this period, offering quiet support even as she admitted her own uncertainty about how events might unfold. "The other servants do not know what to make of you," she said one evening, helping Alira mend a torn hem in the relative privacy of the laundry room. "Some believe you are truly the king's returned mate, destined for a place at his side. Others whisper that Varric is right, that you are nothing more than a convenient excuse for instability the king has brought upon himself through foolish sentiment. What do you believe?" Alira asked. Marla considered the question seriously before answering. "I believe I have watched you work these kitchens with more diligence and kindness than most servants I have known in my years here, long before anyone whispered a word about doors or vows or ancient legends. Whatever else you may or may not be, Alira, I know the person you have shown yourself to be within these walls, and that person deserves better than to be used as a weapon in Varric's political games." Alira found some comfort in those words, though they did little to ease the mounting dread she felt as the day of Varric's formal audience approached. She spent long hours alone in the evenings, returning quietly to the sealed chamber whenever her duties allowed, drawn there, not by the same overwhelming pull she had experienced before the door first opened, but by a growing need to understand the woman whose portrait watched over the room with such quiet, unresolved sorrow. She read through the fragments of history Corwin shared with her during these visits, learning what little remained of the healer who had captured King Aldric's heart 5 centuries earlier, a woman who, by every historical account, had been known throughout the stronghold for her compassion towards soldiers and servants alike, regardless of their station. The parallel struck Alira with quiet, aching clarity, a thread of continuity, spanning 500 years, that felt less like coincidence and more like some deeper truth she was only beginning to understand. On the morning of Varric's formal audience, Alira dressed in the plain servant's clothing she had worn since her first day at the castle, refusing Greta's tentative offer of finer garments, more befitting the occasion. "I am still a servant," she told the older woman firmly. "Whatever else may be decided today, I will not pretend to be something I have not yet chosen to become." The great hall filled with nobles and advisors from across the territory by midday, a tense energy filling the vast chamber, as Lord Varric took his position before the assembled court, flanked by several allies who had traveled with him for this very purpose. Draven sat upon his throne with the composed authority Alira had witnessed during the earlier war council, though she noticed the tension in his shoulders as his eyes found hers, briefly among the gathered servants standing at the edges of the hall. Whatever came next, she understood with growing certainty, would determine far more than her own uncertain place within this castle. It would determine the stability of an entire territory, the strength of a bloodline 5 centuries in the making, and the fate of a vow that had waited far too long to be dismissed now as mere political inconvenience. Lord Varric stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, and the confrontation Draven had feared for days finally began in earnest. "My Lord King," Varric began, his voice smooth and carefully measured, pitched to carry throughout the hall without appearing overtly hostile, a practiced diplomat's approach to what Alira understood was, at its heart, an open challenge to Draven's authority. "I come before this court not as an adversary, but as a concerned ally, bound by the same treaties that have preserved peace across our territories for generations. Speak your concerns plainly, Varric, Draven said, his voice steady, despite the tension Alira could see coiled beneath his composure. This court has no patience for lengthy preambles. A faint ripple of tension passed through the assembled nobles at the directness of the king's response, but Varric merely inclined his head, unbothered. Very well. Reports have reached me, my lord, of significant disturbance within your stronghold. A sealed chamber, closed for 5 centuries by ancient vow, opened suddenly by a servant of unknown origin. I understand you have taken considerable personal interest in this servant since the incident, interest that some among your own court have described as troubling given the current stability of your rule. The sealed chamber is a matter of my family's private history, Draven said. It has no bearing on the governance of this territory. Does it not? Varric's eyebrows rose with practiced skepticism. Forgive me, my lord, but a king, distracted by matters of legend and prophecy, elevating an unknown servant to a position of apparent significance within his court, seems precisely the sort of instability our treaties were designed to guard against. Rival territories watch for weakness, my lord. They watch for exactly this kind of disruption to seize upon. Murmurs spread through the gathered nobles, some nodding in cautious agreement with Varric's framing, others watching Draven with obvious uncertainty about how he might respond to such a direct challenge before the full court. Alira felt her heart pounding as Draven rose slowly from his throne, his expression unreadable, though she could see the careful control he exercised over every movement, every word he chose to speak next. You speak of legend as though it carries no weight, Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Yet you stand within a stronghold, built upon exactly such a legend, sworn by the very king who founded this territory 5 centuries ago. My bloodline has honored that vow through 10 generations of rulers, through wars and treaties and the countless challenges that come with governing this land. You would have this court believe that honoring a promise sworn by my own ancestor constitutes weakness. I would have this court consider, Varric replied evenly, whether elevating an unproven servant, based on an old legend, represents sound judgment, or whether it represents exactly the kind of sentiment that has weakened lesser rulers throughout history. Then let the court judge for itself, Draven said, his voice suddenly ringing with an authority that silenced the murmuring instantly, rather than relying on second-hand rumor and political convenience. He turned toward Alira, standing at the edge of the hall among the gathered servants, and extended his hand toward her with quiet, deliberate purpose. Every eye in the chamber turned to follow his gaze, and Alira felt her breath catch as she realized what he intended. She stepped forward slowly, crossing the vast hall under the weight of countless curious and skeptical stares, until she stood before the assembled court beside the king himself. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let fear diminish whatever truth she was about to share. This is Alira, Draven said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. A servant within this castle for little more than a month, with no memory of her origins before her arrival here. 500 years ago, my ancestor, King Aldric, sealed a chamber and made a vow before his entire court that the door would remain closed until the one it was meant for returned to open it herself, guided by nothing but her own hand. He gestured toward Alira's wrist, and she understood his meaning, pushing back her sleeve to reveal the mark still faintly visible against her skin, drawing a collective gasp from several nobles close enough to see it clearly. This mark matches historical records preserved specifically to identify the fulfillment of that vow, Draven continued. The door opened for her, and her alone, despite 5 centuries during which no hand, noble or servant or king, ever managed to move it. I did not seek this out, Lord Varric. I did not manufacture some convenient legend to justify personal sentiment. I have simply witnessed, alongside this entire court now, the fulfillment of a promise sworn long before either of us was born. Silence fell across the hall, broken only by the faint rustle of nobles shifting uneasily in their seats, uncertain how to respond to evidence that defied the political framing Varric had so carefully constructed. Varric's composure faltered, if only slightly, though he recovered quickly, his voice regaining its measured tone. Marks and legends can be interpreted many ways, my lord. This proves connection, perhaps, but it does not prove the wisdom of allowing such connection to influence matters of governance. Then I ask this court directly, Draven said, turning to address the assembled nobles rather than Varric alone. Has my rule faltered in any way since this discovery? Have border patrols weakened? Have treaties been neglected? Has any decision I have made in these past days reflected anything other than the same careful judgment I have exercised throughout my reign? A murmur of reluctant agreement passed through the hall, several nobles exchanging glances that suggested Varric's challenge had failed to find the support he had hoped to muster. Elira watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the tide of the room shifted visibly away from the visiting lord's carefully constructed argument. "This vow belongs to my bloodline," Draven said finally, his voice firm and unwavering, "and I will honor it, not as a king distracted from his duties, but as a man who understands that some promises outlast even the centuries meant to erode them." Elira did not seek this legacy. She did not ask to carry a 500-year-old promise on her own shoulders, but she has done so with more grace and courage than many born to nobility could claim, and this court owes her respect rather than suspicion for circumstances entirely beyond her control. Lord Varric studied the room for a long moment, clearly recalculating his position as he registered the shifting sentiment among his fellow nobles. Finally, he offered a stiff, formal bow. "I withdraw my concerns, my Lord King. I meant only to ensure the stability of our shared territories, nothing more." "Then let this matter rest," Draven said, "and let this court bear witness to a promise, 5 centuries in the making, finally fulfilled." As the assembled nobles began to disperse, their murmured conversations shifting from suspicion toward cautious curiosity, Elira felt Draven's hand find hers, steady and warm, a quiet gesture of solidarity, before the eyes of the entire court. Whatever uncertainty remained about her place within this castle, within this legacy she had never chosen but could no longer deny, she understood in that moment that she would not face it alone. Winter arrived slowly across the territory in the weeks that followed, softening the harsh edges of autumn with the first quiet snows, and within the castle walls, a different kind of transformation continued to unfold, gradual and steady rather than sudden. Elira no longer worked the kitchens, though she had insisted, against Greta's gentle protests, on learning every aspect of the household's operations before accepting any formal position within the court. She spent her mornings with Corwin in the archives, piecing together fragments of history that felt less like discovering someone else's story and more like recovering pieces of her own, though she remained careful never to lose herself entirely within the shadow of a woman 5 centuries gone. "You are not required to become her," Corwin reminded her often during these sessions, watching her pore over faded journals and weathered illustrations with the same careful attention she had once given to scrubbing pots in the castle kitchens. "Whatever thread connects you to that history, you remain your own person, shaped by choices she never had the chance to make." Elira held on to those words carefully, weighing them against the quiet, persistent pull she still felt whenever she visited the sealed chamber, now opened permanently, its golden light welcoming rather than forbidden. She had come to understand, through weeks of careful reflection, that the grief she carried was not entirely her own, inherited somehow across 5 centuries through whatever mysterious force had bound her fate to an ancient vow, but that the choices she made moving forward belonged entirely to herself. Draven visited the chamber often as well, and Elira found herself looking forward to those quiet evenings more than she had expected when this entire strange journey began. They spoke, in those hushed golden hours, not as king and servant, nor even fully as the reincarnated figures of an ancient legend, but simply as 2 people slowly discovering something neither had anticipated finding within the weight of 500 years of expectation. "I spent years believing this vow was little more than inherited tradition," Draven admitted one evening, standing before the portrait of his ancestor's lost mate, the resemblance to Elira still striking in the chamber's soft light. "A duty passed down through generations, honored more out of respect for the past than genuine belief that it might ever be fulfilled. And now?" Elira asked, standing beside him. "Now I understand that some promises are worth keeping, precisely because they seem impossible," he said quietly. "My ancestor waited 30 years for a return he never witnessed himself, trusting that his bloodline would honor his vow long after his own life ended. I do not know if I would have found that same faith had I been in his position." Elira considered this for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps faith is easier when you have already witnessed the impossible happen once. I do not know what force guided me to this castle, to this door, to this moment standing beside you. I only know that whatever brought me here, I am grateful for it, despite everything it has cost in uncertainty and upheaval." Draven turned to look at her fully then, his amber eyes holding hers, with a warmth that had grown steadily since the night this chamber first opened. No longer the guarded distance of a king, observing a curious servant, but something far more genuine, earned through weeks of careful understanding, rather than assumed through ancient prophecy alone. "I did not fall for a legend, Alira," he said quietly. "Whatever connection binds you to my ancestors' vow, I have come to care for the person you have shown yourself to be these past weeks, independent of any 500-year-old promise. Your kindness toward the staff who still remember you as their equal, your patience with Corwin's endless historical tangents, your courage before Varric's entire challenge, standing firm, despite fear, I could see plainly in your eyes that day." Alira felt her breath catch at his words, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with ancient marks or golden chamber light, and everything to do with the steady, genuine affection she had watched grow between them across these recent weeks. "I care for you as well," she admitted quietly, "not because some ancient vow tells me I should, but because I have come to know you as someone thoughtful and fair, someone who chose honesty before this entire court, rather than convenient political silence, even when it would have been easier to distance yourself from uncertainty I brought into your life." The formal announcement came several weeks later, before the same great hall where Varric had once challenged Draven's judgment, though this time the assembled nobles gathered not for confrontation, but for celebration. Draven stood before his full court, Alira beside him, no longer dressed in a servant's plain garments, though she had insisted on choosing her own attire, rather than accepting anything that felt too distant from who she truly was. 500 years ago, Draven announced, his voice carrying steady conviction across the silent hall, my ancestor made a vow before this very court, that a sealed chamber would remain closed until the one it was meant for returned to open it herself. That promise has been fulfilled, witnessed by this entire court, honored through 10 generations of my bloodline despite centuries of uncertainty about whether it would ever come to pass. He turned to Alira, taking her hand before the assembled nobles with quiet, unshakable certainty. I claim Alira as my chosen mate, not merely in honor of an ancient vow, but because I have come to know and value the person she has proven herself to be, independent of any legend or prophecy. Let this court bear witness, and let any who would challenge this claim understand that it is made freely, with full conviction, rather than obligation alone. The hall erupted into applause and murmured approval, even Lord Varric, offering a stiff but genuine nod of acknowledgement from among the gathered nobles, whatever lingering political ambitions he harbored, apparently softened by the undeniable sincerity of the moment. That evening, as celebrations continued throughout the castle, Alira found herself once more standing before the sealed chamber, now permanently opened, its golden light spilling warmly into the corridor beyond, for the first time in 500 years without restriction. Draven joined her quietly, standing beside her, before the portraits of his ancestor and the woman whose face she shared. 5 centuries of grief, finally resolved into something resembling peace. "The door will never close again," he said softly, watching the golden light dance gently across the ancient stone. "Whatever waits for us now, whatever future we build together, this chamber stands as proof that some promises, however long delayed, are worth the wait it takes to see them honored." Alira leaned against him, watching the light stretch further into the corridor, with each passing moment, illuminating pathways that had remained dark for 5 centuries, and felt, for the first time since arriving at this castle, with no memory of her past, that she had finally found exactly where she was always meant to be. Outside, the first snow of winter continued falling gently across the stronghold, and within its ancient walls, a promise 500 years in the making had finally, fully, come home.